So thanks for joining us, and I think we can start now with Lauren. I hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Let me just share my screen. So Karol, you should never tell presenters that we have more time than expected, but I'll try to stick to my allotted 15 minutes. So thanks so much for including this paper on the agenda today. This is joint with Craig McIntosh, who's at UC San Diego. And so the big challenge that we're looking at in this paper is how can we encourage greater integration of agricultural markets in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the integration of these markets is really of central welfare importance, both to producers who, the majority of the poor are producers working in agriculture and earn most of their livelihoods from agriculture. They rely on these markets properly functioning for their livelihoods, as do consumers depend on these markets for food security. So very important when it comes to welfare. Now, in terms of the degree of integration, there have been major improvements following the liberalization of these markets in the 1980s and 90s, but it's still common today to see pretty large variation in prices, both across regions and across seasons. And this is especially true in more remote markets. So of course, there's many factors that contribute to, for example, the price dispersion observed in these markets. Probably, central is high transportation cost. Road cost, traveling by road in sub-Saharan Africa is sort of the most expensive in the world. But there's other non-transportation barriers that have been getting sort of increasing recent attention in both the trade and development literature. And sort of chief amongst these non-transportation barriers is search costs. So the idea behind search costs is it's costly for buyers and sellers to find each other. This can be true in all markets, but it's probably particularly true in agricultural settings in which harvests can fluctuate from year to year or from season to season. And so both buyers and sellers may have to sort of re-find each other, research in every period. Now, the rapid spread of mobile phones offers the promise to dramatically reduce these search costs. So we've seen even just the introduction of cell phone towers by itself has produced reductions in price dispersion, for example, in Indian fisheries, in Niger and grain markets, et cetera. And there's been sort of following that attempts to build on this infrastructure of mobile phones to develop actual applications that are specifically designed to facilitate search. So the first generation of these approaches was simply disseminating price information via mobile phones to farmers. That's on the whole had mixed results, and I'm happy to chat during the Q&A if folks are interested in discussing, why that might have been the case. But sort of the newest iteration of these marketplaces or sort of initiatives to reduce search cost has been the development of mobile commodity exchanges. So the promise here is sort of offering a centralized clearinghouse with matchmaking services for buyers and sellers to find each other, with the hope that might facilitate search and therefore facilitate trade. So the goal of these platforms is, as I mentioned, first to reduce search. They often have a secondary goal of increasing competition among intermediaries. So, from the farmer perspective, they can potentially access a wider set of buyers at farm gate. And from the trader perspective, they might be able to move into new geographic areas and therefore compete more. And this could have benefits that could trickle up to farmers. So we're going to be looking in this project at the introduction of a particular marketplace called Kudu, which is based in Uganda. It's an SMS-based marketplace for agricultural trade, developed in collaboration with computer scientists at Macquarie University and Microsoft Research. On this platform, which can operate on a simple feature phone, so a non-smartphone like what you see here, buyers and sellers will post the crop they're looking to buy or sell, the quantity they're looking for, the desired price, and the location. They can post via sort of freestanding SMS, a USSD drop-down menu like you see here, or calling into a call center. And the platform then has a fairly complex matching algorithm underlying it that identifies specific trades that it perceives to achieve sort of the global optimum gains from trade, and then it directly connects these buyers and sellers. Along with this matching marketplace, we're also sending out price information via SMS every 2 weeks. We want this to be a really information-rich environment. And this is a lot of SMSs. This is over 25,000 per month. And just a note, it's sent to both sides of the market, so both buyers and sellers. So that's Kudu, although I want to say Kudu is quite similar in a lot of ways to examples that you see sort of across the sub-Saharan African context. So there's M-Farm in Kenya, Lima links in Zambia, Isoko in Ghana. So these are sort of a growing set of applications or marketplaces that are becoming more common in this context. So we're going to evaluate the impact of kudu. We're going to do so in a large-scale RCT. So it's randomized across 110 sub-counties in Uganda. So it covers 12% of the land mass of Uganda. This is really randomization at scale. So there are 55,000 people per sub-county. And the goal of randomizing at this level is to study GE effects on things like local prices and trade. And it's also fairly long run. So we're studying impacts over the course of 3 years. We have a bunch of data collection to measure a variety of outcomes. So we'll look at impacts on trade and market integration using bi-weekly surveys of 236 markets. We'll look at intermediary profits and trading behavior from 3 rounds of annual trader surveys. And we'll look at impacts on farmer revenue and welfare from 2 rounds of farmer surveys. So the final slide before I get to results, quickly on usage. So over the course of 3 years, we see over 23,000 unique asks. These are offers to sell. 30,000 unique bids. These are offers to buy. 7,300 tons of grain is transacted, worth about $2.3 million US. And though the platform is open to a variety of crops, maize is going to account for the vast majority of what we've seen traded, about 2/3. Although there are 19 crops that are successfully traded at some point on the platform. And then quickly, just to tell you about take up within our study sample. So we saw a pretty high take up among traders. So 80% of treated traders posted to the platform at least once, and 22% of treated traders successfully traded on the platform. We see much lower take up among farmers, among smallholder farmers that are in our household sample. So only 24% of treated households post to the platform, and only 2% successfully trade in the platform. And I'll come back to that lower take up among farmers in just a moment. Let me first show you impacts at a market level. So what's happening to trade flows and price dispersion. So before I show you the treatment effects, I want to show you what's happening in control markets. So here I'm showing you for all of our pairs of 2 markets that where both are in control, I'm showing you the probability of there being any trade between those markets in the upper left-hand corner, the number of traders who are moving between those 2 markets, the volume of trade flowing between those 2 markets, and the price dispersion between those 2 markets. So what you see is that, and I'm showing you this as a function of distance between those 2 markets. And so what you see is that, for nearby markets, they have about a 50% probability of directly trading with each other. This goes down pretty substantially with distance. So by about 200 kilometers apart, there's really no direct trade happening between these markets. Similarly, the number of traders starts off between about 2 or 3 for nearby markets and goes down to 0 by about 200 kilometers. Similarly, the volume of trade decays with distance, and as you expect, price dispersion is going up with distance. So that's control markets. Now, what happens when one of those markets is treated, and what happens when both are treated? So what I'm showing you here in this short dash line is what happens when both are treated, and long dash is one treated. And so what you see is that the probability of any trade on the extensive margin goes up. The number of traders who are actively moving between those markets, so trader entry, goes up. The volume traded goes up, and price dispersion is going down. The other thing to note is most of these effects are fairly local, right? Local in the sense of, we see basically beyond 200 kilometers, there's really no trade happening, and that doesn't change with the platform. Most of the effects are happening in this shorter distance. So you'll want to know, are these effects statistically significant? So I'll show you this in this exact same sort of outcome in regression form. I'll show you first for the entire sample, including these far markets where we sort of know there's no treatment effect, and then I'll show you broken up by below mean and above mean distance. So when you look at all markets across all distance, you see a increase in most of these outcomes, but they're sort of weakly statistically significant. So you see a small increase in the number of traders, volumes that are traded, and a reduction in price dispersion, but sort of marginally statistically significant. We divide this up based on above mean distance, which corresponds to about that 200 kilometer cutoff I gave before. And you see, things, most of the action really here is happening below mean. So we see significant increases in the number of in any trade, in the number of traders, in volumes, and significant reductions in price dispersion between markets. Really nothing is happening beyond about 200 kilometers. And our hypothesis is, transportation costs are just so huge at that point that it's not search costs making the marginal difference for far away trades. The final thing on heterogeneity for the market level effects is I want to show you what happens in relative surplus versus deficit areas. So on the left-hand graph, I'm showing you here just the price in each market based on its baseline marketed surplus. So you can think of here on the left, this is relative deficit areas. On the right, this is relative surplus areas. So as you'd expect, in the control markets, which are these dotted line, the short dotted line here, prices are high in relative deficit markets and low in relative surplus markets. What's happening with treatment is that prices are dropping in relative deficit markets, right, as crops are flowing in, and they're increasing in relative surplus markets as crops are flowing out. So the right-hand graph is just showing you essentially the difference between treatment and control, as well, along with the 90 and 95% confidence intervals. And you see this drop in deficit markets is not quite statistically significant, but the increase in surplus markets is highly statistically significant. Okay, so my final few minutes, I want to just quickly tell you briefly about what's happening to traders and to farmers. So I'll show you, we've got a bunch of results here, but I'll just show you the basic results given a short time frame. So on trader impacts, we're seeing a reduction in trader profits. This is pretty sizable. This is about a 14% reduction in profits. We try to unpack the channels through which this profit reduction is happening, which are in the second and third column. Now, these are not statistically significant, but they're suggestive, which is, this suggests that markups are going down while volumes traded are going up. We think this is consistent with the story in which traders are moving into new areas. They're competing more in new areas, so they're selling, they're trading a larger volume, but their markups are getting squeezed as they're competing with each other. I'll also say very briefly, there's some heterogeneity in this effect across traders. So what we're seeing happening here is really a compression of trader markups. So we're seeing for traders who initially had fairly high markups, we're seeing they are in lower markups when they're treated. And conversely, for the low markup traders, they're seeing higher markups. And so what we think is happening here is the search cost platform is helping the relatively smaller traders start competing with the larger traders. On farmer impacts, so we look at impacts on revenues, quantity sold, and price. So on revenues, we're seeing a pretty large coefficient. This is about a 9% increase in revenues, but you can see it's nowhere near statistically significant. And so one of the things that we think is certainly contributing to the noise in that estimate is the lack of take-up or the lower take-up among farmers. So luckily, we had anticipated there might be low take-up, and so we had pre-specified in our pre-analysis plan that we would conduct essentially a propensity model, propensity to use kudu, and we would estimate that in the treatment group, and then apply that model to the treatment group and the control group, and look at heterogeneity based on that predicted propensity to use kudu. So here, among people who are likely to use kudu, this high propensity group, when they're treated, we do see significant increases in revenues and quantities. But I want to be clear, this is a small group of farmers, and it tends to actually be the wealthiest farmers. So it's the wealthiest farmers and the largest farmers who are most likely to use kudu. We rationalize this by thinking about there being some fixed cost to searching or adopting new technology. So it's really among the largest farmers among whom we see increases in revenues and quantities sold, et cetera. So this is helpful for farmers, but the most of the gains are really concentrated in sort of the right tail of farmers. So I'll conclude. So we find that this mobile-based search platform seems to increase trade and market integration, albeit primarily locally. By facilitating trader entry into new markets, platforms seem to reduce intermediary profits. However, it seems like these mobile-based search platforms may have a hard time reaching sort of their promise. So the way they're often billed is as being sort of able to directly connect smallholder farmers, particularly in remote markets, to say Kampala or the capital city. And in fact, we find these benefits are mostly regressive. So most smallholder farmers seem to be too small to make using the platform profitable. And that use and gains are concentrated among the largest farmers. So it looks like this platforms can be useful for integrating these markets and reducing search costs, but it's not going to be the thing that gets the remote small farmer sort of connected to the capital city. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. I just want to remind participants to submit your questions via the Q&A box, and I would like to move on to Joshua Deutschmann, presenting on contracting and quality upgrading. Can you share your screen, Joshua?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. Hopefully you can still see that. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here on this excellent panel and be sharing this paper. This is joint work with Tanguy Bernard at the University of Bordeaux and Wambi Yamayogo, who's at IITA. So in this paper, we're looking at the issue of quality upgrading, and in particular, the potential for a contracting intervention that addresses a series of potential constraints to facilitate and induce quality upgrading. So the motivation here is that we think that linking producers to export markets can be welfare improving. But producers must be able to meet international quality standards in order to access these markets. And we know from existing work that these quality standards can present a major barrier to market access. In addition, there's evidence in a variety of contexts that suggests producers, especially small producers in agricultural areas, cannot reliably obtain price premiums for quality. And so we think that contracts may be an effective tool here to encourage investment in quality, both by addressing constraints for producers and by aligning incentives between producers and buyers. And so the research question we're addressing here is, can a new contracting arrangement, which resolves price premium uncertainty and credit constraints, induce quality upgrading? So the context of this study is groundnut cultivation in Senegal. Groundnuts are a big deal in Senegal. They're the most valuable agricultural export. They're widely consumed locally as well, and they occupy more than 40% of cultivated land. And so groundnuts, as well as a variety of other staple crops, including maize, are vulnerable to aflatoxin contamination. Aflatoxins are a class of highly carcinogenic compounds, as well as causing a variety of other health effects. And one study estimates that more than 4 billion people may be chronically exposed to aflatoxins. So this is a pretty significant and widespread public health problem. But these phytosanitary standards that are imposed particularly by higher income countries, they also restrict export market access for producers. So we work with groundnut farming cooperatives in Senegal for this project. These are organizations which already aim to provide for their members a variety of services, including access to credit, access to purchase inputs, training, and a guaranteed market for their output. And so we think that these cooperatives may be a potential channel to facilitate contracting and quality upgrading in this context. So what do we do in our experiment? In partnership with 2 cooperatives in Senegal, we designed and implemented a new contracting arrangement with 3 key components. First, we provided credit for the purchase of a new quality improving technology, and I'll provide more info on that in a couple of slides. Second, we provided an ex-ante guarantee of training on the use of the technology. So farmers knew at the time of purchase that they would have support from a cooperative extension agent to know how to use it correctly. And third, we provided an ex-ante guarantee of a price premium conditional on meeting quality standards at harvest time. So again, farmers knew that they would be able to earn additional money if they purchased and correctly used the technology. So we ran a cluster randomized trial with 396 farmers in 40 villages to test this contract. And we measure the impact on 3 main outcomes, which I'll talk about today. First being the decision to purchase or adopt this new quality improving technology. Second, on quality itself, and in particular, we'll look at compliance with strict export standards. And then third, we'll look at output sales to the cooperative, which is an important outcome for thinking about whether or not an intermediary or a cooperative may be interested in implementing a contract like this in practice. And so what we find is, just to preview the results, that farmers do adopt this quality improving technology at significantly higher rates, on the order of 60 to 80 percentage points, depending on how exactly we define that outcome. And we do see increases in production quality and compliance with international standards, but these improvements are really concentrated in areas where we think quality would otherwise be low. I'll give more information on that as well. And then finally, we do see that farmers offered this bundled contract choose to increase their output allocation to the cooperative at both extensive and intensive margins. And we see some interesting and important heterogeneity there, looking at behavioral characteristics and relationship value, which is important to think about in a context where the potential for formal contract enforcement might be low. So as I said, we're looking at one particular kind of quality measure here, which is aflatoxin contamination. Aflatoxins are toxic compounds that are released by a fungus that occurs in soil and spreads to crops during the growing season. It can also spread post-harvest, particularly when storage conditions are poor. The public health effects are quite serious. It can cause liver cancer. It can stunt the growth of children. It could cause immunosuppression. And there's also kind of heterogeneous regulation that producers and exporters face. If they want to sell to the European Union, they face really strict export standards of 4 parts per billion. If they want to sell to many other countries, and in particular China, which is a big buyer of Senegalese groundnuts, the nominal standard is 20 parts per billion, although anecdotally, even that standard may not be as strictly enforced. And importantly also, there's no regulation domestically in Senegal for the sale or production of groundnuts. Another really important thing to know is that aflatoxins are not directly observable, so it requires a chemical test to confirm contamination, although crops which are particularly moldy or otherwise low quality are also probably contaminated with aflatoxins. So if you're a producer, how do you reduce aflatoxin contamination? Work in the literature has focused on what a set of post-harvest practices, such as drying crops on a tarp or using improved hermetic storage. These are both very effective strategies. But in this paper, we're going to look at something slightly different, which is biocontrol technology, and in particular, this technology called Aflasafe. So this is a new product that is being redeveloped and adapted for African contexts. In every kind of country or region, it has to be kind of customized to the strains of fungus that occur naturally in that area. So in particular, it launched in Senegal for the first time on the market in 2019 after more than 5 years of efficacy trials. So it's quite simple for farmers to apply. They apply it during the growing season, 4 to 6 weeks after they plant. It may have some advantages over the other approaches. Depending on how long farmers are able to reuse their hermetic storage, it may be cheaper. And there's also some evidence that it can provide lasting protection to crops, even with poor storage. So this is particularly attractive to exporters, for example, who want to be able to test what they buy and be able to ship it confidently to export markets. So quickly on the design, we offer all participating farmers in the experiment, both in the treatment and control groups, the ability to purchase 10 kilos of Aflasafe for sale at market price. So this is kind of it was still rolling out generally in the market, so we wanted to ensure that it was available to all farmers. We also offered access to free quality verification, and I want to be clear that this is not necessarily certification that farmers could take and sell their production elsewhere using that certification. This was kind of specific to production sold to the cooperative. And then, as I said, we offer treatment group farmers these 3 components of the contract on top of this. We offer them interest-free credit for the purchase of Aflasafe, which they can repay in cash or in kind after harvest. We offer a promise of a visit by a technician from the cooperative. And we offer them a guaranteed price premium of 7 cents per kilo, conditional on quality certification. And the break even is at about 240 kilos, which is much less than the expected production on 1 hectare. So I won't linger long on baseline characteristics. Our sample is pretty balanced. The one thing I want to highlight, which I think is quite interesting in this context, is that despite both the economic and public health implications of aflatoxins for groundnut producers, at baseline we found very low awareness of aflatoxins. Only about 10% of farmers said that they had heard of it at all. So our outcomes, what I'm going to show today are all dummy variables. I think it makes it really easy to talk about for quality and output sales. We also look at in the paper kind of a more continuous measure. I'll show adoption based on administrative data from the cooperatives who manage the sales of the product, but our outcomes are quite similar using end-line survey data. And then for quality, it'll be a dummy equal to 1 if the sample complied with EU phytosanitary standards. These were samples that we collected in December and January after harvest and measured using a mobile lab that we set up for the project. And then finally, we'll look at output sales to the cooperative, and this will come from end-line survey data. So our econometric setup, very straightforward here. We're just going to include a treatment dummy, commune fixed effects, as this was the level of stratification, cluster of standard errors at the village level. In the paper, we show that everything looks similar if we include a bunch of farmer baseline controls as well. So, all right, turning into these kind of average effects here. So first, looking at adoption, what we see is that there are some farmers in the control group who decided to adopt the product, about 10%. So some of them may have been motivated by the potential health benefits or optimistic about finding a buyer. And then when we look at adoption in the treatment group, this is quite a large treatment effect kind of on this first outcome. About 90% of farmers in the treatment group decided to adopt the technology. So this is pretty large relative to the existing literature. Existing work, although in very different contexts, has found that each kind of component of the contract that we consider individually is rarely sufficient to induce large changes in adoption behavior. And there is some increasing evidence, including some work by my co-author Tanguy, as well as some work that I have in another context, that bundled programs that address several constraints together can have large impacts for farmers. So then turning to the question of quality itself, aflatoxin contamination. What we see is that there was kind of moderate levels of contamination in the control group. So more than 30% of farmers were in excess of these strict European limits for aflatoxin levels. So I'll come back to this in a couple of slides, but some of this may be driven by growing season conditions. We don't see adoption of other complementary practices for aflatoxin mitigation in this context. So our average treatment effect is positive, but it's not statistically significant. So this is kind of only suggestive that on average quality improves. But as I'll show in a couple of slides, there's some meaningful spatial heterogeneity here. And then finally,
so
yes.
You have 3 minutes.
Yep, got it. Thanks. So finally, looking at the decision of control of farmers to sell output to the cooperative, we see that surprisingly, there's quite few farmers who sold any output to the cooperative in the season we study. So this was a season where spot market prices were quite high and cooperatives were not paying very well relative to the market. Farmers are also able to get paid more quickly in markets. And so we do see that there's an increase on average of likelihood of selling to the cooperative. And we similarly see at the intensive margin that there's an increase in quantity sold to the cooperative in the treatment group. So then in the last couple of minutes, I'll just talk very quickly about two sets of kind of heterogeneous effects that are particularly interesting and important. So there's quite a bit of work across contexts showing that aflatoxin levels are highly variable across space and time. Even within the same farm, the risk of contamination can vary quite a bit from season to season. And a lot of this is driven by growing season conditions. So there's some work in agronomic literature that shows that incidence of dry spells and that the temperature during the growing season in particular are factors which can really influence the risk of contamination. So we take we take remote sensing data and the samples from our control villages and kind of estimate, predict a contamination risk for all of the villages in our sample. And what we see is that in these low risk villages where most farmers were already in compliance with these standards, there's no detectable treatment effect. And in fact, there may be room for kind of complementary practices here to really help farmers do better. Whereas in these high-risk villages where there was much lower compliance with these strict quality standards, we see that that's exactly where the treatment has a really big effect on improving quality and standard compliance. So that's kind of what we would hope, that this treatment is most effective in the areas where it's kind of most needed. But there's still room for additional work to understand how to get to kind of 100% compliance with standards. And so finally, I'll just wrap up and say, there's quite a bit of work that addresses kind of relational contracting in a range of contexts, the role of reputation and potentially kind of non-pecuniary motives like reciprocity. And so what we find is that there is kind of some important heterogeneity in the decision to sell output to the cooperative by some things that we think are predictive of relationship value, like lead farmer status or tenure, membership tenure in the cooperative, the number of years that a farmer's been a member. And I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. So I will wrap up there. I'll just kind of, to sum up, we find that this bundled intervention is really effective at encouraging investment in quality. And we do find improvements in quality itself, but that these improvements are really concentrated in areas where quality would otherwise be low. And we find some interesting kind of behavioral heterogeneity in this outcome on kind of output sales and what we call contract success. And there are some important issues to think about when considering scaling up an intervention like this. Access to testing and certification infrastructure is still really limited. We had to kind of bring our own testing infrastructure for the context of this project. There's also, issues of credit constraints at the cooperative level if they wanted to provide additional credit to their members. And as we saw also that yields for farmers on a per hectare basis are still quite low. So understanding how to kind of bring in complementary inputs like improved seeds as well. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great presentation. Thank you, Joshua. Yes, please send your questions via the Q&A box in case you have any. And now we'll move to the last presentation by Giulio. Can you share your screen, Giulio?
I think I can now. Great.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Very glad to be here, joining this excellent panel. And today I'll be talking to you about a project that I've been working on with Bryce Alvarez Pereira, Sebastian Schaber, Davidson Tavares, and Adusi Mendonça. And what we have been trying to do is to measure the impact of a market information system on cashew producers in Guinea-Bissau. And the sort of motivation for the project is very similar to, somewhat to what Lauren discussed earlier. And it's kind of, the starting point is that in theory, we think that market efficiency is based on the assumptions that agents are well informed. But in contexts such as commodity markets, especially in Africa, in African countries, we find that when markets are not geographically concentrated, or they're not very well connected, producers may not be well informed, they may not have access to information at the right time when it might be useful for them to know if it's a good time to sell their products or not. And if information is costly, that might, and hard to acquire, it might lead to inefficient outcomes. So what we're trying to ask is, can the timely communication of price and market information benefit producers' economic performance? And specifically, we're looking at price and revenue. In a way, how we're going to do this is by conducting a two-level cluster randomized control trial in Guinea-Bissau, where we essentially set up with several partners a market information system of the like of the old generation that Lauren talked about, with a small twist that I'll mention in a second, given that we were providing weekly information to treated producers using a combination of push calls, SMS, and interactive voice response systems, which previous market information system that relied mostly on text messages did not use. So just a preview of the findings. What we find is that treated producers that received our information ended up selling earlier relative to others, more frequently, and larger quantities of cashews. And I'll tell you a little bit later why these dimensions are relevant in this context. What we do find is, perhaps disappointingly, that they don't sell at higher prices, but the sort of variance of prices in the treated group is a significant 0.2 standard deviations lower than in the other groups. And so we see some price concentration of better informed farmers. The fact that producers are selling more and larger quantities does have a noisy effect on revenue, even if they're not earning higher prices. So we estimate a 16 percentage point increase relative to the control group, but I take that with a pinch of salt because it's a noisy estimate, and so I don't want to push it too far. Where we think we are contributing is relative to the previous literature, is that we're focusing really on showing how information frictions can affect producers' decision of when to sell. And most of the studies that I've looked at informational frictions in agricultural commodity markets have focused on improving, making farmers better off, or improving market integration on a spatial dimension, so focusing on where farmers sell. And other frictions such as credit and storage constraints have been shown to affect the timing of sales, and so the spatial arbitrage that farmers and producers can have in marketing their output. So what we're trying to do is kind of combining these two things in the sense that we're showing how information frictions can also affect producers' decision of when to sell. The second contribution is, as I mentioned earlier, relates to the actual intervention that we're introducing and studying, and the fact that we're focusing specifically on audio recorded messages delivered through an IVR. And this had not been done in the past to deliver marketing advice. These type of intervention had been used to provide agricultural extension advice, but not the sort of weekly messages that we're providing. And as Lauren mentioned in her presentation, again, sorry to refer to your slides again, but we seem to have a lot of reference in common. Previous studies found mixed results when using SMS or text-based information, but whenever the information was communicated by radio, the results weren't as heterogeneous or null. So jumping a little bit into the cashew nut market and why this context is important for the contribution we're trying to make. Guinea-Bissau is a price taker in the world market of raw cashew nuts. Guinea-Bissau is a small country in West Africa. It's about the size of Wales. And you might want to think of cashew nuts as a cash crop commodity that has a similar value chain as coffee or cocoa, which have been previously studied in the literature. And raw cashew nuts are a pretty important crop for Guinea-Bissau. They account for about 90% of its exports revenue and about 25% of GDP, and more than 80% of production in the country goes into exports. So what we know from sort of anecdotal evidence is that price volatility both across seasons is high, but also within season is significant. And this type of volatility isn't communicated well to farmers during the trading season, which happens every year between March and August. And the one thing to mention is that cashew nuts are not usually stored across seasons. So producers tend to sell their output about once or twice during the trading season, but they do not really tend to carry that output over across the next one. So to try and reduce the informational barriers that producers in this context face to access information, we partner with the world expert on cashew markets, an information system provider called Encalo, and the mobile operator MTN. We set up this information system that I've kind of posted a picture of on this slide. In Guinea-Bissau, the system had been working already in other cashew producing economies, started off in Côte d'Ivoire, but didn't operate in Guinea-Bissau before we joined up with these partners. And what we did was to sort of start in 2019 with a baseline survey and a training of treated producers, and information dissemination took place in 2020. And we followed up with treated producers towards the third quarter of 2020 using a phone-based survey, which we had to kind of improvise a little bit due to the pandemic. So the study design, just to set it up, is as follows. We work with 290 villages, and we randomize before baseline villages into two groups. 2/3 of villages are allocated to our treatment group, and 1/3 roughly is allocated to our control group, where we just do surveys. We don't provide any information or training. In the treated villages, we conduct a second randomization after the baseline, and we sample seven producers in each treated village, or in each village. And in the within village randomization, 4 of these producers are then randomly allocated to take part in a training session where we explain what the service that they're going to receive for free will be like, how they can use this information to improve their marketing outcomes. And 3 other producers that are randomly not selected to participate just act as a within village spillover group. And then we follow them up, as I said, over the phone. And on average, just to give a sense of magnitude, there are about 30 producers in each of our villages. And for a back of the envelope calculation, the total production that we account for in our sample is probably around 2% of the total production of Guinea-Bissau in terms of 1,000 tons. So just to give a quick detail on exactly what information producers are receiving, because many of these market information in systems change quite a lot, the type of information that producers are receiving. So what this service is offering is simplified news about the national cashew market. This might be something about whether the opening is being delayed or whether demand has increased in other importing countries, such as India and Vietnam. A range of farm gate prices across different regions. So whenever there is a range, sometimes the price was just an average with not much movement. But try to avoid averages to give producers, to avoid giving producers any sense of false hope that that's exactly the price they're going to get. And finally, and probably most importantly, there is a component of the messages which includes some marketing advice, which is based on both the national market analyst understanding of the market, but also international market conditions from neighboring countries, which are collected by the market information system in CALO. And so that just gives a sense every week to producers whether prices are likely to go up or down in the coming week. So on top of after the baseline, as I said, we followed up with a 15-minute phone-based interview. And during that interview, we essentially collected information on every sale that was conducted in a trading season. And as I said, there were about 1 or 2 sales per producer in this context. And every barter, which is quite important for the results that I'll tell you about in a moment, in the sense that many producers engage in bartering of cashew nuts directly for rice, which is a staple good in this economy, and loans that producers have taken out, and some of those loans would have also been repaid through cashews. Just to give a sense of the sample, we're working with small producers, about 3 hectares per plot in average, and given that cashew nuts grows on trees, they're pretty small in terms of output. 98% of sales take place in the village. This is relevant given the fact that I'm trying to focus on this intertemporal arbitrage dimension as opposed to the spatial arbitrage dimension. And the reason why all the transactions take place at the village is because there are either local buyers that live in a village, there are about 3 on average in each village, or there are itinerant buyers that travel across the country during the trading season and visit villages at their farm and then engage in a transaction. We try to improve measurement of the sales by leaving diaries to producers after the baseline. And when we asked them during the phone call whether they kept it, 98% said yes, and about 67% said that they used it. So we're hoping to try and potentially collect those diaries in the future. The response rate to the phone-based survey was about 76%, which is not great, but at least it was balanced across treatment arms. And in terms of take-up of the intervention, around 78% of producers received at least a message. And we have some variation, which I'm not going to really exploit in this talk, in terms of the intensity of how many messages people receive. But for the sort of average, the treatment on the treated effects I'll show you, I'm using just a dummy variable for whether a producer has received at least a message. And so as I was hinting at, the estimation method is a pretty standard ANCOVA, where I am focusing on individual level outcomes, clustering the errors at the village level, given I randomized at the first randomization at that level. I'm including some triplet fixed effects that I'd use in the village level randomization. And then what I'll be presenting today is mostly the coefficient beta on the treatment effect, And if there is interest, I can also show the results for the spillover group, but we don't find many spillover effects.
Giulio, you have 3 minutes, all right?
Okay, great, thanks. So the first result is the fact that producers are selling more frequently, and so at the extensive margin, the control group did at least 82% of the control group sold at least once during a trading season. This was a little bit unusual in this season. We expected everyone would sell, but in this context, many producers actually opted just to barter. And so treated producers actually ended up reducing the extent to which they bartered. And those are about 10% changes on the extensive, percentage point changes on the extensive margin. We find that those effects varied over time, in the sense that the filled markers are for sales and the hollow ones are for barters. We find that producers tended to sell earlier and barter less over time, and particularly they barter a lot less in the later months of the trading season, which last year extended a little bit over August because of the delays due to the pandemic. Treatment also seemed to change the buyer that producers engaged with. And interestingly, because producers had more information about the prices, they might have engaged more with the local buyer that is always readily available, as opposed to relying on the heterogeneous buyers that come over time during the season. And so we find an increase in whether producers sold the majority of their output to a local buyer. Disappointingly, as I preempted, we find some negative effects, which are small in magnitude on the average price per sale. But looking at the distribution, I think that those effects are mostly driven by a small group of producers that seem to be selling at very high prices. Most of these might have actually sold to the market, still a small proportion does. But what I find striking in this histogram is the fact that the treatment group has a high bar on the sort of average, and there is a smaller concentration of prices in their distribution. We also find that, as I preempted earlier, they tend to sell more in the sense that the price here for not having sold is set to 0. And the standard deviation of the distribution is smaller in the treatment group by about 0.2 points. The quantities also increased. It wasn't just an extensive margin, also led to increases in the amount sold. Those are a bit noisier. And those amounts sold for cash also led to an increase in the revenue. But as I said earlier, this is a noisy estimate, but it's quite high in terms of magnitude, in the sense that it's about 16% of total revenue. And so to summarize, we find that giving access to market information reduced the variance of prices among treated producers, and we didn't find many spillovers. We think that a reduction in the volatility of prices can be well for improving if we think that producers are risk averse. And in the context of the negative price shock caused by the pandemic, the information seemed to increase the producers' willingness to sell for cash and reduce their barters. And we're still really much in the working process stage of the project, and trying to collect a little bit more data to tease out some of the role that buyers have and the willingness to pay for the service, and whether the intervention reduced waste, which is partly accounting for why treated producers could sell more quantity. So that's kind of what we're trying to go next. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulio. Very interesting. So let us move to the Q&A session. First, we have a question from Tillman about the presentation of Lauren. Tillman, can you ask it?
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Karol, and thanks, Lauren, for the presentation. I wanted to ask a bit more about this heterogeneity that you find in terms of the farm size or like volumes that farmers sell. So could you just speculate why you think it is that small farmers were not trading as much as you may have expected? Was it that they didn't try to sell as much through the platform, or did they just not find buyers as much as larger buyers did? And relatedly, sort of what is is my idea right that a trader would have to visit a lot of small farmers to sort of aggregate the volume that he may otherwise get from a large farmer to make just to collect the volume that he may want to trade with a different area?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's sort of, there's a couple fixed costs that could be involved, right? So there's fixed costs on the demand side, as you propose, that for the, the way it works typically is farmers will sell at farm gate and the buyer comes to them, the trader comes to them. So there's fixed cost for the trader of sending out a truck to a given area. And so I think that's, fixed cost on the demand side. There's probably also fixed costs on the supply side. Thinking about sort of, either adopting a new technology or but just posting this platform, you can think of those as fixed costs. And there's some, related work, for example, in Treb Allen's Econometric piece showing that, larger farmers are more likely to search because the fixed cost is sort of worth it for a better price for a larger volume to sell. So I don't know that we're able to differentiate the two, although I think your question raises sort of an interesting idea for me, which is, the way that we're developing that propensity to use the platform, we're developing that model based on actual successful transactions. We could also develop that model based on just whether they post. And you might think that successful transactions have to do with both the supply and the demand side, whereas the posting has more probably to do with the supply side. Now, it's not totally clear because, of course, a small farmer might not post in anticipation of having a hard time, having a buyer come out to them. But I think you might think that those help differentiate the two, and we haven't done that. So it's a really interesting idea, and I think we'll pursue that. So thanks, Tillman.
Can I maybe ask as a follow-up, if I may? Do you think is there an issue of understanding among the farmers of this particular service that larger farmers may just have an easier time using the service in particular, or would your understanding be that the technology is as close to usability as it could possibly get?
Yeah, so we obviously did a lot of work to try to make it usable. We actually had these in-village agents who are training people and helping them to post to the platform to try to take away that challenge of just, technological literacy or new technology, whatever it might be. And that's why we have multiple ways of posting. So you can call in, you can text, you can use the USSD. But of course, I think there's still probably challenges to adoption, and those challenges might be correlated with things like education levels, which might also be correlated with farm size. So we can't necessarily say that what's driving this is farm size versus, say, some correlates like education. It'd be interesting to look at the model and see, what happens when we control for education. Do we still see it's larger farmers, conditional education, who are using the platform? That might help to, tease out some of this collinearity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have one question from Doug to Joshua.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Joshua. Great presentation, really interesting work. I have a question, I guess, around whether the Aflasafe technology is itself the important ingredient here, or whether, in fact, the testing and screening by itself would allow farmers to certify their maize as aflatoxin-free, access the higher price. And in a sense, I guess my question is, aren't there two different elements here, both of which are kind of separately important? One is kind of creating a separate marketing channel for aflatoxin-free maize, potentially to the EU. And the other is a technology that might let you achieve low aflatoxin levels. And sort of those two things are complementary here, but potentially you could just think of a separating sort of a separate marketing channel as being the intervention that really creates demand from farmers here.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the kind of the key challenges here, and I think in general, is the combined fact that aflatoxin itself is not observable, and that tests are costly and require infrastructure. So, we thought a lot about this, and kind of the inspiration for the design of this project was that a lot of the early kind of exporters that were starting to test Aflasafe in Senegal in particular were working with groups of farmers in which they would actually, they would observe farmers applying the technology to their fields, and that gave them a pretty good signal about quality, such that then maybe they wouldn't have to do quite so many tests on the back end. So in our project, we tested at the individual farmer level because we wanted to kind of measure that outcome individually. But I think thinking about scaling this up, one of the advantages of this technology, and other technologies can also provide that observable kind of hint that things are good quality. But in particular with this one, if you go, it's easy to go to a field and see that someone has applied it. They're little blue grains. You can look at the field, you can take a picture. So I think that, you know, you're right that part of the issue in general is that there isn't a reliable channel for farmers to sell high quality products. But I think that part of making that channel available is also that, you know, these buyers have some confidence that what they're buying is not, they're not going to have to run a costly test and have it be wasted. And farmers may also not be willing or able to invest in such a costly test without some confidence that their quality is good.
Thanks.
Thank you. There was one question in Q&A to Giulio. Person was asking about explaining more the results for the spillover group, and if you could, Giulio, speak a little bit more on the randomization design at this level.
Sure. So we didn't find many spillover effects, and we found that the treated group was statistically different from the spillover group. And the way we created the spillover group was by conducting a lottery after the baseline survey, where 4 producers were selected into treatment and 3 producers were not, and those that were not constitute our spillover group. So those are producers that are living in the villages and might have interacted with the treated producers through day-to-day interactions. But the only thing that we did see a hint of is that actually the quantity that spillover producers tend to barter is higher. And I'm not quite sure whether that is somehow compensated for the fact that the treatment group is bartering less. So that's why we would like to understand a little bit more whether there is some fixed supply of barters and whether we are moving people away from them, and the spillover group is then entering more in those transactions.
All right. Thank you, Giulio. Let's go to the second round of questions. There's one by Mattia to Lauren. Mattia, can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I was obviously typing the question while Tilman was typing the question, so I realized my curiosity was vaguely similar. But I was also wondering a bit more about this size heterogeneous effects you had, and I was wondering if you have information about the capital endowment of these larger farms, because I understand the main mechanism you have in mind is that the buyers come to the farm, but then I was wondering if with better information on prices, larger farmers with the availability, for instance, of a truck can decide not to sell to the person who comes to their farm, but rather, you know, go further out in the country and sell at a better at sort of better conditions. And related to that, if I may, linking this same question to Giulio's presentation, you only have a subsample of farmers at the lower end of the distribution, if I understand correctly. So around 3 hectares per farmer. So I was wondering if some of these mild effects you find might be related to the fact that you're actually capturing small farmers rather than big ones, that Lorraine's presentation has shown to be more responsive to this type of treatments. Thank you. Sorry, I've asked 2 questions in one.
We can take turns. It's fine. And actually, I think it's useful to kind of combine this question into both me and Giulio. So, yeah, I mean, my read on sort of the mixed results that you get from just the pure SMS only interventions is exactly the challenge that you put your finger on, which is, for many small farmers, I think, you know, they can get information about there being a better market price and some market far away, but if they can't actually get there, they don't have, you know, the access to a truck or sort of sufficient size that makes it worth it to hire those fixed costs of transportation. What are they going to do with that information? And then maybe they can use it to have better bargaining with their local trader. But if the trader knows they can't actually access that outside option, it's not clear how it really changes their bargaining dynamic. So I think what's unique about the Kudu marketplace and these sort of mobile marketplaces is the model is you can actually access other markets without physically transporting there. So the market comes to you is the basic idea. So the vast majority of sales on the platform happen at the farm gate. So it shouldn't be a matter of you having to transport elsewhere. Although it is true, we're also giving out price information. And so it'd be interesting to see, you know, and we haven't looked, but we can, to see among the farmers who, you know, we're seeing big effects. You know, we think that's happening from the propensity to use Kudu, but it could also be happening partially by getting better price information and then being able to transport to other markets. So we do know the location of their sales, so we can look into that.
Giulio, do you want to chip in?
Sure. For the context that I talked about, I can say that I think there might be some commonalities, and thanks, Mattia. I think that in my head, at least, there is a parallel, something parallel happening in the sense that when I didn't present them, but when I look at the heterogeneous treatment effects by plot size, and I just focus on producers that are in the top terrestrial distribution, I think that the revenue effects that I see, the sort of revenue increase, is mostly coming from them. And so in a way, it does seem to me that producers that have a larger supply, a larger capacity, and might, as Lauren was saying, also have better education or just more wealth. And so other constraints might not be binding as much, then those can actually make better use of the information and sort of improve slightly on their marketing outcomes. So I think when I just focus on that subsample, I do see that information seems to make them slightly better off.
Thanks, Giulio. We have one question from Bob Bolch to Joshua. Most evidence suggests that adoption of Aflasafe alone is insufficient to reduce aflatoxin to European safety levels. Instead, a combination of technologies, meaning Aflasafe plus better drying plus Purdue improved crop storage bags, are needed. The question is, what can your RCT tell us about uptake of combined technologies?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess, you know, when in our context, what we see is that you know, farmers do improve their quality, but that it's not sufficient to get to kind of 100% compliance with these standards. And so I definitely think there is room for adoption of kind of complementary products and practices like better drying. And what we see in our data, both at baseline and end line, is that there's very little to no adoption of kind of improved drying on a tarp. There's little to no adoption of PICS bags or hermetic storage bags. So there's definitely room for both here. My worry is about the price premium element here, is that, you know, using all of these things together becomes quite costly. And I wonder about the return on investment in kind of using all of these things together. So I think that's an open question. That's something that we're hoping to maybe dig more into in follow-up work in Senegal. I would also welcome some of the evidence that you're aware of in other contexts. I know that there's been some work on Aflasafe in Kenya, and which has differed somewhat from the more kind of agronomically focused research, which shows that in controlled settings, this technology is super effective and it reduces aflatoxin levels below detectable levels almost across the board. We know that in the real world, it's never quite as simple. And so I think part of that too is understanding the role of kind of training and information for farmers to make sure that they're really using these technologies as effectively as possible to get closer to these effects that we see in the more controlled agronomic studies.
Great, Joshua. There's also one more question from from Doug to Lauren. Doug, do you want to ask it now?
Sure. I have lots of questions for Lauren, but again, just great work. Just kind of thinking and really almost free associating around the attractiveness of the platform. It strikes me that something like this, trying to reach smallholders, that the attractiveness would vary a lot across crops or commodities. And for crops that are largely home consumed, obviously there's not going to be a huge demand, and the quantities that farmers are going to take to market are small. And then for things that are already done through contract farming, chili peppers or something, you don't need it because you already have a buyer lined up. And so just trying to think, it's, and equally then things that are non-perishable like coffee, probably it's not going to be super necessary because you can find a buyer. And so if you kind of zero in and say, where would this really matter? It ends up leading me to think about things like horticultural crops for the domestic market, kind of fruits and vegetables for domestic buyers. And I wonder if you wanted to give this a really good chance, kind of zeroing in on a set of commodities where there really is a market friction around information and matching suppliers and buyers. I wonder, does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we started the project, so I focused mainly on maize because that's the vast majority of what ended up being sold on the platform. We did, however, actually also, the platform's open to, I mean, we had 19 crops that were actually sold, and I think there's like 75 crops and actually livestock on there that can be posted. So there was one sale of piglets, for example. So it's a really wide range. The platform is kind of agnostic about the particular crop. We saw almost no usage of the platform. Sorry, I wanted to say we intentionally measured outcomes on prices for not just maize, but also for a few perishable crops like tomatoes, for example. So we thought, okay, tomatoes are a place where you might see it's highly perishable, search costs really matter. This kind of harkens back to Rob Jensen's work looking at fishery markets, where it seems like, you have to literally throw out your fish at the end of the day. This is a place where high search costs could really matter. We saw almost no adoption of the platform
just maybe to get us started,
crops, and that was very surprising for us. The thought is that search costs are sort of most harmful for perishable. On the other hand, the platform also requires a little bit of time to find a buyer as well. So for example, it's quite common that people would post and it would be a few days later that we would find them a buyer. And so I think also the challenges of waiting on the platform are also higher for perishable commodities as well. And so, I think that's why we saw very little take up. People just weren't willing or able to wait the few days it would take to find a buyer. Now, that's all conditional on the level of adoption that we saw on this platform. And one of the challenges for this question and many questions, when you think about sort of the impact of these marketplaces, is all the treatment effects can potentially vary by scale. So you might imagine if you really could scale up to a level where you had super thick markets, really rapid transactions, then you could find that, finding a tomato buyer for your tomatoes is super valuable. But if we're in kind of this early startup phase and it takes 2 or 3 days to find a tomato buyer, then it's not going to work for tomatoes. So this is all speculative, but that's my hypothesis as to why we saw greater adoption of the platform for non-perishables, even though I agree, I think search costs are sort of higher or more binding or more harmful for perishable commodities. So it's this interaction of like, where is search costs most harmful and where is it sort of feasible to use the platform? Same thing for distance, by the way. So we thought we'd see greatest effects at far distances. That's where search costs are highest, but it might also be not the binding constraint at that point. So, transport costs could be a binding constraint at that point.
Thanks, really interesting.
Joshua, I have one question to Joshua. I'm wondering, Joshua, whether there is any price premium absent your intervention in the domestic market for the certified mycotoxin-free maize. I guess this question has 2 dimensions. One can be that households could value this better part of crop more for themselves and leave it for home consumption. And the second dimension, I guess, is whether your intervention is likely to have some long-run impact, whether the market will be rewarding, these higher qualities.
Thanks. Yeah, so as far as we know, and this is something that we're hoping to collect better data on in a follow-up project, there really isn't another channel by which farmers can be rewarded for low aflatoxin groundnuts. And this goes back to the idea that testing is really costly, and there's nothing really directly observable. So they may be rewarded based on observable quality characteristics, some of which may be correlated with aflatoxins, but in general, there isn't even really access to testing infrastructure for either sellers or buyers in local markets. The testing infrastructure that exists is mostly for like large scale exporters who want to test a container before they ship it out. So, you know, what I'll say about the kind of the price premium is that there were quite high spot market prices in the season we studied, and so kind of the ex post premium was effectively zero. Farmers who produced high quality were able to earn roughly the same price by selling to the cooperative as by selling in outside markets. Farmers who produced low quality would actually earn a higher price by selling in these spot markets because they would earn the same price, whereas if they sold to the cooperative, they would earn a lower price. So it's not surprising that we see that given that pattern, that more farmers in the treatment group elected to sell some of their output to the cooperative. For them, this was effectively no loss, and they were able to kind of reinforce their commercial relationship with the cooperative, which is valuable. The cooperative allocates access to inputs, access to kind of complementary trials and information, maybe not so much information, but certainly access to credit based on their perceived reliability. And so members who they see as kind of regularly participating in the cooperative's activities and selling some of their output to the cooperative, that's valuable to maintain that relationship. And so it makes sense that given that trade-off, more farmers in the treatment group did so. But it does mean that kind of ex post, we don't detect any sort of impacts on profits.
Thanks. Makes sense. Makes sense. And there's one more to Joshua by Christine Mazur from Western Michigan University. She says, it sounds like farmers who purchased Aflasafe mostly ended up selling on the market and did not receive a premium. This means that their profits decreased. What does this mean for farmer incentives to adopt going forward? This is a product that has no effect on yields and no observable effect on quality.
So yeah, kind of related to what I was just saying, but yes, it's true that in kind of the ex post, there was not an effect on profit. What I'll point out is that the spot market prices in Senegal are quite volatile year to year. And from one season to the next, they may increase or decrease by 50%, largely driven by demand from Chinese buyers. So for farmers who are relying exclusively on the spot market for their incomes, that's quite volatile from year to year. And so one of the advantages that we think of kind of providing this high quality option is that these prices are more stable. The demand from the European market is more stable, and while ex post there may not always be an available premium, in expectation there should be. And so, you know, I think that's something that we're going to dig into going forward with this line of research, is understanding the dynamics of farmers' decisions to adopt, and how kind of past experience with the technology affects their decision, especially given the fact that again, aflatoxin is not an observable dimension of quality. And you're right to point out that there are no effects on yields, either positive or negative.
Thank you, everyone. So let us open now a panel discussion, and I think there's one question from Doug to all three speakers.
I don't know if it's quite a panel discussion, but I have a question that I think relates to all three of your papers, which is really to what extent the things you're looking at and focusing on are really related to information and marketing, or whether someone like Mark Rosenzweig, I think, would argue that these are all issues that are disguising problems related to scale. In other words, to some extent, are we simply picking up a lot of farmers who are operating at too small a scale to take part efficiently in agricultural markets? And I ask that in part because there's a lot of literature arguing, sometimes persuasively, I'm not sure, that the increasing returns to scale, that there are no important increasing returns to scale in agricultural production, but I'm wondering whether there are increasing returns to scale in marketing, and whether that's what we're picking up to some degree in the heterogeneity that you're all finding here. So I wonder if I could just ask all three of you to comment on that, and maybe just in the spirit of screwing things up, can maybe I ask Giulio to start and work in sort of reverse order here. That's fair?
Thanks, Doug. That was an easy one. No, that's an excellent, very, very interesting question. And I mean, are there increasing returns to scale to marketing? I don't have an answer for that. I think it's definitely one that should be sort of, that I would like to maybe spend a bit more time thinking about. The one thing that I'm also wondering is to what extent not necessarily relational contracts, but sorry, not necessarily increasing returns to scale, but relational contracts play a role, and then might be something that is lingering in the background. This maybe is where Joshua's project actually hones in on establishing our relationship. But I think I'm going to have to try and dodge the bullet and pass it on to the others to figure out whether marketing can have increasing returns to scale.
So to follow up on that, I think in Senegal, in this context, for sure, scale is an issue of access, particularly to these higher value markets. When I started kind of conceiving of a project working with groundnut farmers, I was talking to exporters who just either aren't willing or aren't able to deal directly with small farmers. I mean, a single truckload of groundnuts is 20 or 25 tons. That's the production of 30 or more farmers at kind of the median level of production. And so, you know, dealing with any individual farmer who is going to fill a 30th of a truck is really not feasible for somebody who's in Dakar or in a big city. So, you know, that's part of the reason we focus in this project on kind of the first building block in this relationship, which is in this chain, which is between a farmer and the cooperative who is operating. These cooperatives are operating at a sufficient scale to contract directly with exporters. And so understanding the constraints to getting to the cooperative level in which they can aggregate a sufficient quantity of output and encourage the kind of the quality investment that's needed is, I think, you know, it's necessary but not sufficient to really think about achieving the kind of scale necessary to really unlock these higher value markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on something very important here across the three papers. So certainly, you know, we're finding that, as I mentioned, sort of both on the supply and the demand side, you can think of there are these fixed costs to finding each other, to sending out a truck, to investing in search. I'd imagine, Josh, for your situation, there's fixed cost to testing probably, as well as sort of contracting frictions as well. It's why you see, I think, in some places, you know, vertical integration when contracting frictions are hard. It's easier than a single firm to do that. I also imagine, you know, things like bargaining power and getting sort of good prices for good quality, all those things could differ if you had sufficient size vis-a-vis the buyer. Yeah, so I think all these things change the scale, and I think it's a very interesting proposition that there are these important scale effects for marketing, which to me very much rings true across a bunch of these facets.
Thanks, everyone. Giulio, did you have one question to
Lauren?
Lauren?
Yes, just I was wondering whether the Kudu platform has any way of punishing users that are not fulfilling the contracts that the trades that they bid, and so kind of thinking at the back of my head, like, to what extent relations matter, to what extent people are worried that they're not going to get the thing that they were promised on the platform.
Yeah, so this was a huge issue, and we approached it in a bunch of ways, none of which are particularly successful, but I'm happy to kind of share the behind the curtains backstory of how we try to get this. So the platform itself had thought about a bunch of ways to try to even just, first of all, specify quality, which they ended up not doing. So there's no quality specified on the platform. That's not because quality doesn't matter, although, you know, for maize, it matters less than maybe some of these export crops. But it's because it's very difficult, even just, first of all, to communicate quality on this platform. So it's on feature phones. How do you discuss quality? People don't really use the term grades that are typically used in like the capital city. They're not often used by smallholder farmers. What do you mean by that? And then moreover, the issue you raised about how do you do that credibly and how do you commit people to that? So there's quality issues. There's also kind of just quantity when you show up. Are things there that were promised to you? So there's risk to the buyer of saying, am I going to send out a truck to this remote area to buy from someone I've never bought from before? And so our thought was, you know, as you're reducing search costs, you're also sort of raising some of these new frictions that can potentially be overcome, as you're saying, with relational contracts. When you break out of those existing relationships, these issues come up. So a couple of ways that the platform thought about doing this, they thought about doing almost like a Yelp-like rating system. So maybe you could kind of aggregate reputation across a bunch of people. So you and I are only interacting once, but maybe also you sold to Joshua. The challenge there is that buyers use the platform quite a bit, and you can imagine developing a sort of credible signal on the reliability of the buyer pretty quickly. The seller's a little hard, so farmers typically only sell sort of once or twice per season on the platform, and so it just takes a long time to get a credible signal on the farmer. And it's really, to some extent, in terms of this risk of kind of who's making the investment up front, it's actually the buyer who's making the investment to send out a truck. And so you really want a credible signal on the farmer. Is this farmer reliable? Are they going to have the quantity as promised, the quality as promised? And it just take a long time to kind of build up a good reputation. Maybe over time it's possible, but I think it's difficult. One thing we tried to do within the RCT is we tried to then have an alternative way to get at this risk channel. So we actually randomly offered a reimbursement to buyers if they showed up and things weren't as promised. And we kind of varied whether it was sort of just basic on quantity or whether it's more comprehensive and also included quality as well. We don't see much of an effect from that guarantee offer, and it's a little hard for me ex post. I mean, if we had seen an effect, that'd be great, and we could say kind of this is giving some sense of, you know, risk matters. If you don't see an effect, it's a little hard to know, is that because risk isn't there or because they didn't trust us? So, you know, for this guarantee to matter, they have to trust us more than they trust the farmer, and who knows if that, you know, if that trust level was there. So I think this is super important, but I don't think we're going to have a satisfactory answer to it within our paper. But I think this is a huge area, especially, again, as you move towards, you know, more search, connecting new trading partners, these issues become even more salient than they were before.
Thanks, Lauren. Just a last question before we finish from myself. I very much liked how the law of one price was operating in your project. You found that this price was dropping in areas with surplus, right? And going up in deficit areas, right? Is it
the opposite? Actually, it's falling. So deficit, you know, deficit areas start off with high prices and they fall,
right?
As grain is flowing in, and they increase in surplus.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah.
But then you found insignificant effects on revenues of farmers, right? So I was wondering whether you tried to look at the profits according to the deficit surplus area, or was
yeah, and we actually do find significant increases in revenues for farmers who are in surplus areas in particular.
All right.
Exactly as we expect.
Mm-hmm. Right, then I think these are all questions we had for today. Thanks everyone for great presentations, great discussions. Tomorrow we have a labor topic day. We have 3 sessions. At 12 p.m. UK time, we have a job training session. Then at 2 p.m. we have young people and women in labor markets. And then finally at 4 p.m. we have effects of shocks on labor market outcomes. So everyone is obviously invited, and we are looking forward to seeing more of you tomorrow.